Artistic articulations on atom. Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element which can exist and still hold on to a true power-driven senses of behavior and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of small tiny specks, which are protons and neutrons, that make up the center speck, called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck, 1. Protons, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 2. Neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 3. Electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge. Atom. Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element which can exist and still hold to a true power, driving sense behavior, and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of tiny specks, which are protons and neutrons, that make up a center group called nucleus. The electrons that are put in order to spin around in the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck, 1. Proton, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, or plus. Atom, small tiny speck, 2. Neutron, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 3. Electron, usually power driven for a negative charge.
Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element which can exist and still hold on to a true power-driven senses of behavior and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of small tiny speck, which are protons and neutrons that make up the center speck called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck, 1. Protons, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 2. Neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 3. Electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge.
Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element which can exist and still hold on to a true power-driven senses of behavior and physical nature. Atoms consist of three main types of small tiny specks, which are protons and neutrons that make up the center speck called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atoms small tiny speck, 1. Protons, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atoms small tiny speck, 2. Neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atoms small tiny speck, 3. Electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge.
Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element which can exist and still hold on to a true power-driven senses of behavior and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of small, tiny speck, which are protons and neutrons, that make up the center speck called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck, 1. Protons, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 2. Neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck, 3. Electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge. Atom is the tiniest grain of matter in an identified element
which can exist and still hold on to a true power driven senses of, behavior and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of small tiny speck, which are protons and neutrons that make up the center speck called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck 1. Protons, usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, small tiny speck 2. Neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck 3. Electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge.
Artistic articulations on atom.
Atom is the tiniest grain of matter and an identified element which can exist and still hold on to a true power driven senses of behavior and physical nature. Atom consists of three main types of small tiny specks, which are protons and neutrons, that make up the center speck called nucleus, and electrons that are put in order to spin around the nucleus. Atom, small tiny speck, 1 proton is usually power driven for a positive charge. Atom, small tiny speck 2, neutrons, no power driven electrical charge. Atom, small tiny speck 3, electrons, usually power driven for a negative charge.